Good evening, everyone. This is a meeting of the Citizens Advisory Committee for Capital Expenditures. Today is Thursday, February 22nd, 2024. This is a continuing series of meetings regarding the city's capital needs inventory as we've been going through these capital needs and having some presentations. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on streets and traffic capital needs. There are a couple of things, however, from the previous meetings, leftover items I wanted to just go over really quickly. I'm going to share my screen on those if I get to that correctly. Let's see, screen one. Here we go. Okay. First, I did want to point out that we have an updated version of the capital needs inventory. We discussed this before. There was a typo on one of the green column items under parks. I think it was something like $30 million garage doors. Thank you, Dennis, pointed that out. That's been corrected. So you see the totals. You're going to see that the green, what was undesirable. It's not something we've been focusing on, but it was a difference there. So, but this is posted on the website. And then also, they're following up on some questions regarding the MBE, WBE. I know, Mr. Irons, you had some questions about that. We do have some example projects listed. This also is posted on the website under tonight's agenda. And you can see that Rich has provided some information on those. These are some just sample projects dated as of February 16th. And then there's a larger one related to the convention center as well. And it's got some information under that in terms of the W and MBE participation on those. Again, a lot of our capital projects are ongoing or not complete yet. But if you had any questions on that, Rich could address those. But this information, again, is posted on the website under tonight's agenda. It's just following up with some questions we had from previous meetings. Sure. Yeah. I'll get those links and post it on the chat. That's one of the suggestions. Thank you. So that's covering some of the older material that we had to follow up on from previous meetings. Going forward, we've got traffic and streets capital meetings. Rich, I forget you had given me an order of presentation. Did you want to go ahead and just introduce who you have for us tonight, and we'll just take it from there.
Sure will. Thanks, Paul. So tonight we have, we're going to talk about three areas, three different presentations. The first presentation will be John Kohler, who is a professional engineer, BPS planning executive, and he's going to go over in a PowerPoint street projects. Then we're going to move to Commissioner of Traffic, Jamie Wilson, and he will go over a couple projects that deal with traffic and lighting. And then last but not least, I will cover a slide on the ADA transition plan. I do want to mention that Scott Ogilvie, who is one of our chief planners with Planning and Urban Design Department, is also here tonight. If there's any questions that need to be asked that for some reason one of us can't answer, Scott can supplement that as well. And then also with the ADA transition plan, I am going to present that, but I also want to recognize that Commissioner David Newberger is also on this committee, and David has worked very closely with us for many, many years to get this plan in place. So I would ask that after I make some comments there, if David has anything for the good of the order, that he do that as well. So let's start with John Kohler and his presentation on streets.
Thank you, Rich, and good evening, committeemen. Okay, I assume you can see my screen. So I'm here to present 8 transportation improvement projects. 5 of them relate to roadway improvements, and 3 are tied to traffic signal interconnections and upgrades. On this slide, I've got several organizations that partner with the city of St. Louis on the various projects that I'm presenting. We've got strong private partner relationships on many of the projects that we manage here at BPS. So our first project involves Cass Avenue improvements. It's a transformation of Cass all along a 2-mile stretch from Tucker, which is near I-70 exit on the east, and west toward Grand Avenue. This is a total project cost of about $24 million. The project's 1 mile north of downtown, and it travels through the Jeff Vanderloo, the Carr Square, and the St. Louis Place neighborhoods. The entire stretch of this project is located in a historically disadvantaged community, an area of persistent poverty, and is located in the Promise Zone. This is the second part of the promise that SLDC and the city made to NGA to relocate to North City. The first stretch of major roadway that was tied to that relocation was the Jefferson Corridor, which we are now in the midst of the final stages of construction. And then that runs north-south, as east-west provides a high-quality transportation corridor to get access to not only through these neighborhoods, but also to support that NGA development. It is about 30% complete with design right now. We are planning to submit a raise grant next week with the federal ask of about $15 million. Senator Blunt has already provided a congressional earmark for $5 million to support the project. And the ask of this committee and the Capital Committee is an additional $3.8 million, which is about 18% or so of the total project cost. So the project involves a lane reduction from 4 lanes to 1 lane in each direction, with a median and turn lanes at the intersections. It also provides a high quality multi-use trail for bicyclists, the pedestrians, or other users. New curb on the roadway, new sidewalk. The whole corridor will be ADA compliant. We are raising intersections at the stop control locations, and we're implementing new smart street lights with 5G capability. Traffic signals along the corridor will all be upgraded and interconnected to the real-time transportation intelligence center. And we're going to pilot electric vehicle charging stations along the route at key locations. We've got some landscaping. We've been working with Bi-State on transit upgrades as well. Next project involves Kings Highway improvements from Gravois to Nottingham. This is the southern end of an ARPA-funded paving project and traffic calming project. We did not have enough funding to implement a traffic study that was completed in 2019 by 3 aldermen in this stretch of Kings Highway. This $2 million will support the recommendations that were in that traffic study. Namely, it will be multiple traffic calming and safety measures. We are planning a lane reduction similar to what was done at Hampton. We've got concrete bump outs, medians at select locations, enhanced crosswalks, bicycle markings, all new curb ramp upgrades at intersections. And the biggest component of this cost, and I've shown a picture on the right graphic, that is a shot of the study showing what the intersection of Neosho and Kings Highway will look like. We are planning to build a new traffic signal at that location And that green area is where we plan to close off that difficult merging area of Christie into Kings Highway. So that's a high crash spot that will greatly improve through that new signal. We are also implementing buffered bike lanes, and then the asphalt paving will be done under the original ARPA allocation by the city street department. Our next major transportation project is an application that we just submitted in early February to rehab River to Pear from Gravois to Lansdowne. This is a $20 million project. As many of you know, the lanes are very skinny. There's a lot of curvature, high crash corridor. We've got problems with the pavement is in very poor condition. We have submitted this grant and anticipating 16 million in federal funding with the 20% match, as Rich mentioned, 20 cents on the dollar. We would requesting 4 million to support that grant. We'd start design in 25. It would be constructed in 28 or earlier if we accelerate it. But we are planning to keep 2 lanes of traffic in each direction, but widen it slightly and build a raised concrete median to reduce head-on crashes. We're looking at auxiliary acceleration and deceleration lanes at Chippewa, dedicated turn lanes at all the northbound intersections. So there'll be brakes in that concrete median to allow traffic to turn into those intersecting streets without being rear-ended. New guardrail, high friction pavement at the crash locations, and some directional signage, chevrons where you've got a curve in the road, just to increase awareness of upcoming curvature of the roadway. We've been working with Bi-State on transit stop upgrades. Right now, there's bus drop-offs with no connections to the opposite side of the street. So we'll be building flashing beacons, medians, and access to those transit stops. We'll have some street trees along the corridor, lighting where we're missing or need more lighting, and then I mentioned new curbing along the entire stretch. So the next 3 projects involve signal interconnect. These types of projects allow the city to link up traffic signals and upgrade equipment to current technology. This first one is on Dr. Martin Luther King from Hodemount to Grand. It's about 3.7 million. We have secured the grant already through congestion mitigation air quality. So again, 2.9 million federal, 20%. We are looking for 800,000 of local match. We are in the process of selecting a consultant. We'll start design this summer. Construction start in 26. And I did want to just mention the timeline. It might seem like long durations from when we submit an application to end up constructing, but those timelines are tied to the availability of funding for each phase of a project that are governed by our municipal planning organization, East West Gateway. So they tell us when you're eligible to submit for design. These projects need right-of-way and then construction. So it's a multi-year process on all these federally funded jobs. But this one's 3.8 miles, 7 locations of intersections with new signal equipment. And the cameras that are installed are all tied to the real-time intelligence center, which gives us access to monitor and control the stretches of roadways and optimize the traffic flow. and ultimately reduce emissions and improve air quality. But coupled with these types of projects, we upgrade all the curb ramps at every intersection along the corridor. Similar, we just submitted on early February, 2 major CMAQ projects, one on South Broadway and one on North Broadway. South Broadway is from Marcel to Carroll, $10.5 million total cost, 8.4 federal. We are asking for 2.1 local match. It's 6.1 miles. All the same type of features that I described for MLK are in this project as well. There's 21 intersection signal upgrades in this stretch. And very similarly, we submitted the North Broadway Interconnect, worked very closely with streets to identify and prioritize these projects and which ones the city would pursue in this particular year. We submitted this in early February. Cass to Riverview. This is 7 million, 5.6 CMAQ, 1.4 local match request. Also start design 25, construction in 28. It's 6 miles of fiber at 13 upgraded signal equipment locations. Our next job was a close partnership with Bi-State. We had an opportunity to submit a transportation alternative program grant. We worked with them to identify a project that involved upgrading 92 bus stops along 3 arterials. And I've listed the arterials in the title: Grand from Holly Hills to I-70, Cass MLK from Kings Highway to Grand, and Delmar from Hodemount to Kings Highway. But we are looking at providing 10% of the total cost. Bi-State will provide the other 10%, equaling 20, and the $3 million projected cost would yield 2.4 federal, and then 300 for requests of the city and 300 from Bi-State. We'll start this design in 24 with construction in 27. Bi-State does a complete ridership analysis to determine what level of amenity should be provided at each bus stop. That usually the amenities are based on ridership, popularity of the bus corridor. So the higher ridership, you're going to get maybe shelters in place, more benches, or and then maybe, or we will be looking at upgrading ADA accessibility for all those 92 stops. I don't know if you can see the picture in the middle, but that is a shelter with a tree right next to it. You could see very limited access for accessibility to that bus stop. Those are the types of things we'll be looking at for accessibility sidewalk improvements tied to this. And then lastly, this is a strong partnership project with Greater St. Louis, Inc. It involves transportation alternative program funding. We have secured this grant. It is a 1.8 miles of bicycle, pedestrian, and various traffic calming improvements, like bump outs and enhanced crosswalks. The cycle track will be located on 4th Street from Shoto on the south to Convention Plaza on the north. That picture in the bottom is a study rendering that was completed recently, showing you see the little shades of green. That is the 2-way cycle track on the west side of 4th Street. And we've been working very closely with the various neighborhoods and business associations and businesses on both Washington and Fourth Street. We were meeting with them, I believe, in next week. I know Dennis Bogdanovich on this committee is very actively engaged on this project. It is about 60% done, and we want to start construction in 26. But the piece of Washington is from 3rd to 14th. No high-end bicycle improvements, but you'll see other traffic calming, like a Ray's intersection at Washington and 8th Street, bump out some changes to parking and other features, enhanced crosswalk markings and things like that. And that is all I have for my projects.
So Paul, I think there's a couple questions in the chat. You want to handle
Yeah.
those before we move on?
Yeah, let's get to those questions. Dallas had a couple questions. Are any of these projects coordinated with other partner adjacent projects to reduce construction impacts to residents?
So I'll start that conversation and then see what John or Scott might have to add to that. But John showed you a slide up front of all the organizations that are involved in partnerships with us as we do projects across the city. Beyond city agencies, we work with any organization in the city, including the aldermen, the neighborhood groups, and so forth, to make sure everybody is aware of what we were doing. And remember what John said is that the funding deadlines or timelines are really dictated by East-West Gateway. So what we try to do is to get the grant first, see what our timelines are, let folks know what the timelines are, particularly aldermen who are going to expend ward capital funding, and make sure that we're not doing something that is going to, impede or be tore up later at a different point in time. John, you want to add any comments to that?
No, that's well said. I mean, we work with the utilities to let them know what our plans are and timelines and encourage them to do any of their capital upgrades. And then any developments along these corridors, we might become aware of them as we're engaging the community of future exterior improvement to a property or what have you, and we work with them as we are aware of those types of improvements.
Okay, next, are there funds being earmarked for future maintenance of these improvement projects?
So my comment on that would be this. Any project that we do that is federal, we are required to sign in the grant assurances that we will maintain it and keep it up to standards. And so not exactly per project do we put money into a pot, but I will tell you that there is roads and bridge funding, that is capital funding, there is St. Louis Works funding for repairs to roads and bridges, and the street department as well gets funding for their typical maintenance. So between all those different pots of funding, we keep these projects maintained well once we build them. Because remember that when we apply for future grants, if we're not doing something we're supposed to do, that hurts us going forward. John, you have anything else there?
Oh, that's well said.
Thank you.
And also, I was going to add, and when I saw that, like for instance, on the project related to bus stops, the city's providing the infrastructure, but the bus stop itself is a bi-state maintains those and is responsible for those.
That's right.
Okay, next, when Spire Ameren dig up a street for work, who is responsible for certifying that the patch job is acceptable? And what ramifications are there when the street is not repaired or in a sufficient manner? Very good question.
So I will take that one, and I will ask if Scott or Jamie have anything else to add beyond that. But what happens is they are permitted through the city to do their work. The street department then, street division, street department then works with the contractor, the utility, whoever's doing the work in the right of way, make sure they have proper traffic control and so forth. And then there is a final inspection completed through the street department when it's all said and done and signed off on. So streets does not report to me. Jamie or Scott, any comments on that?
No, I think, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Jamie. You first.
Okay. I think Rich described it well. When contractors do work in the right of way, they're required to pull a street permit for blocking a lane or excavation within right of way. And as such, they're linked to an inspector who monitors that permit, especially for the final sign off on how the pavement's been restored to verify that it has and the quality in which it has.
And it's the contractor's responsibility to do that. The streets doesn't do that and then get reimbursed or something like that. Is that right?
They do, and this is, I'm speaking for the street division, but they do have agreements where they'll come, the street division will come back and finish off the last couple inches to top it off. Sometimes if it's a dead of winter, they may just have the contractor fill it all the way to grade with concrete instead of leaving that in that situation for 5 or 6 months till summer. So it varies.
All right. Thanks.
And let me just add on to that one because a lot of people may or may not understand that last comment. So asphalt plants typically close from November to 15th until the beginning of about April. And so what Jamie's comment refers to is that if they're working in the dead of winter on an emergency project in the right of way, rather than leave it at a sub level where cars are bouncing through that, what they will do is allow, even on an asphalt street, a contractor to fill it all the way to grade with concrete, so that's a level driving surface.
Okay. And I did have a follow-up as well. So when we talk about priorities and funding, obviously when we've got a grant secured, and so we've got the funds for the project, that sort of moves it up on the priority level simply because we've got the funding there, and all it requires is the match. So when you talk about these are grants that have been secured, I understand that. In terms of the ones that we are applying for, is there a typical time in which it takes to hear back, and then whether or not the grant's been awarded, or is it just varies from project to project?
John?
Sure. So the majority of the projects that have not yet been secured, and they are the STPS, Surface Transportation, the CMAC, and the TAP projects, when they're solicited, say February 8th, which was this last round, typically at East-West Gateway's Board of Directors late August meeting of 24, there'll be a final answer. But it goes through several committees prior. It goes to the Transportation Planning Committee in May with a recommended by East-West Gateway staff. That TPC recommends to the Executive Advisor Committee, I think in the June timeframe, but the final confirmed decision to determine that that grant has been awarded is the end of August of 24, the same year that it's applied.
Okay.
But one of the benefits of asking this committee for these, for one, we're very confident that we'll get the funding. And then by having the funding in place, we can then begin selecting our consultant, writing an enabling ordinance, and get that all in place without being behind the 8 ball. If we could get this money earlier, we could start designing the project on time or ahead of schedule.
All right, thanks, John. Yeah, and Ivy had a question, and I'll jump to it now, but simply because I don't want to forget it. But is there anyone on staff coordinating the schedule of utility work with planned street maintenance? So in other words, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Ivy, but for instance, when we go out and do some paving, and then a utility comes in and tears it up, I think that's what she might be getting at. Is that coordination between the two, so that we don't have that type of situation where new paving is torn up for utility work?
So yes, so let me break it down into 2 different ways. So for example, the 5 corridors that we're doing from north to south, that we're working on ARPA funds now. The utilities have all been involved in the design and the construction, and they are aware of what we're doing. When it comes to typical street maintenance, the street department handles the milling and the paving, and so the street division coordinates with the individual utilities, which are generally Water, Spire, and Ameren that are in the public right of way. Now, I want to caveat that, and I said this yesterday in a committee hearing, and it's important everybody to understand this. You can coordinate until the cows come home, but if there is an emergency and there's a break or there's a problem, it doesn't matter whether we pave the street or not. They are going to come in and they're going to have to cut it up in order to do that. We try to minimize that so that we don't pave a street and they come in every 10 feet and cut blocks out of it. But at the end of the day, there's always this agreement that when emergency work happens, they come in and they fix their utility. Correct, Jamie?
That's absolutely correct.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Another question from JP. Assuming we adequately maintain federally funded projects, does this mean projects that are locally, state, or privately funded are secondary in capital expenditures? That's the first question. And then how do we or the feds determine what is adequately maintained, especially when applying for new grants from the feds for new projects? I'll take the first half of that, and I think it's as we talk about prioritizing projects and funding, we sort of recognize that we only have so much funding to go around. So I think one of the reasons why we focus a lot on what federal funding is available is simply because you get so much more for the dollar. On a 4-to-1 match, it just carries us so far. It's not so much that the particular project is necessarily a higher priority. It's just that the funding availability, the local dollar goes so much further when you're only paying 20% of the project. But that leads you to the second part of the question, which is an interesting question. How do we or the feds determine what is adequately maintained for new grants for new projects? So how do they go in to say this is a priority project the Fed is willing to fund?
Well, I mean, I think at the end of the day, what the question's getting at is how do they know whether we're maintaining them when we apply for grants? And so East-West Gateway, our MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization, is located right here in town. And their executives are right here in town. And we deal with them on a regular basis. I'm there, John's there once a month. The street director's there with the mayor once a month. This is a very, very active organization. And so what I would tell you is we don't try to maintain things at the minimum. Myself and Jamie and John and a number of others are professional engineers, and we are tied to the code of ethics of the city and being professional engineers that we do things correctly and we keep them up to standards. And so there's always eyes and ears that are out there. And believe me, if something was not being maintained, if there was a problem with it, phones start ringing, particularly the mayor's phone would start ringing. And I can tell you, if her phone rings, all of ours ring twice as loud. So we work very hard not to ever let it get to that point.
Hey,
Again,
Rich,
Jamie, any comments?
yeah, I do have a comment on East-West Gateway's application for every one of these federal projects. There is a specific section in the application that identifies maintenance. They ask you to define what the city will be doing for maintenance on this project, and then they ask you to estimate the annual cost of maintenance for what you're proposing on the project. So every project's unique, I estimate. What I believe is the type of work that we normally would do for roadways, and then I assign a dollar value. So I think the exercise is East-West Gateway wants the local government agency to be well aware that you've got to maintain what you're building, and then we program for that through streets maintenance.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, but there's one thing I want to add as well,
Sure.
Paul, this in regards to these large these large roots, these tree roots that's damaging these sidewalks around the city. especially in North St. Louis, to a point where it's been neglected for so long. It really actually is critical in my estimation. And I want to know why we don't have anything in the budget to address that issue. We got citizens, especially seniors, cannot even go down the sidewalk. They got to go in the streets, just go all around just to get to their houses because of these sidewalks are damaged by these big, large tree roots. And I think that it need to be addressed. And why come we don't have any money in the budget for that?
Actually, we did have we do have a $6 million in allocations towards sidewalk repairs from ARPA funds in an earlier iteration. I don't know, Scott, I don't want to put you on the spot there, but could you describe sort of how that's going, or what the thinking is on how that's going to be implemented?
I think Jamie or Rich could probably better
Okay.
answer the $6 million question.
Okay.
I will add that we are about to begin the citywide transportation and mobility plan in the coming weeks, and part of that planning effort is going to be an ordinance, policy, and procedure review. And I think Mr. Ironsell, makes a good point that that's certainly an area that we can and should look at in the course of that planning, and see if there's a more equitable way we can, make sure the sidewalks are maintained. Additionally, the city just adopted an ADA transition plan, which did a very thorough analysis of many streets within the city and assigned some priorities for areas where we need to be more proactively doing maintenance and replacement of sidewalks to make sure they are accessible and usable. So I think that's an additional big step in the right direction that gives us the information to make decisions and seek funding to make those enhancements.
So I'll just add on, Scott, that was well said. Besides the transportation mobility plan, keep in mind that the last slide here, we're going to talk about the ADA transition plan, which also a portion of that addresses sidewalks. But I do want to mention what Paul was talking about in Board Bill 120. There were $6 million in there for sidewalk repairs. The street department is looking at that funding and where the best places to allocate that funding are. Then beyond that, there are two other programs that the city has, which is the citywide sidewalk program, where an alder would come to us and say they want certain pieces or blocks of sidewalk replaced. And then another option is the 50-50 sidewalk program, which is administered through the street department. And so a resident could get on to that list where it's a 50-50 split between them and the city to do that program. And last but not least, I want to mention this because this is a pilot program that we're starting on. And John Kohler was really in charge of this with street department. And that is, we're looking at a program, and it's called precision cutting. And so if we could get this program pilot and started, we would go around the city, and in the worst cases of sidewalk heaving and so forth, we would literally come in there and laser cut these walks to be transitional again, so that until we had a funding available or until we could get the sidewalk replaced, that would be a quick response of how we could address that. So your point is very well taken. It's a very legitimate point, and we certainly are working on that.
Okay, we do have a follow-up question from JP on the answer to the previous question on the federally funded projects. Basically, how do we balance the proposed maintenance fees that we were talking about with the backlog of capital expenses accumulated over time? And is that backlog taken into account when determining funding for new projects? So given the existing amount of inventory that we have to deal with, do we take that into account when we go out to get new projects funded?
I would say we do. I believe that, we fund roads and bridge money, and Paul, you could probably speak to that a little bit, where that funding comes from, but that's generally a pot of money that is provided to us to do maintenance and roads and bridges and the amenities, so forth. as we go through this, but generally what we don't do is program, a portion of these capital funds for maintenance. That's either done, like I said, through, that other capital fund we talked about. It's done through St. Louis Works funding. It's done through, 1010 budget funding to, the street department, or even at the very worst case scenario, at times, the aldermen throw some ward capital towards it as well. But there are a number of different areas where that maintenance funding could come from. I would say generally it's in the street department's budget to do, its general maintenance of the streets and things within the public right of way.
And a follow-up to that follow-up, which is the feds, do the feds take that into account? I'm assuming they do when we do the applications, but I guess that's the question.
Well, again, like I said before, and John mentioned that it is in the application. I'm really glad he mentioned that. So there is an expectation going into the grant of what is going to be done. And so at the end of the day, if something would be in disrepair, and we would get a call about it, we would fix it in short order. I honestly cannot tell you that we have received any calls in the recent past from, the East-West Gateway or MoDOT or the feds saying, hey, something's in disrepair and you need to get out there and fix it, unless it was created by a vehicular accident that came up and somebody just happened to see it before it got turned in. But generally, we're very, very good about the maintenance.
All right. Are we ready for the next segment of presentation? Would that be the traffic division?
Yes, that'd be, Jamie Wilson, Commissioner of Traffic.
Hey, Paul, do you have the slides there? Or do you want?
Yeah, I can pull that up.
Okay.
Let me do
Thank
that
you.
right now. Let's see.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for having us here. Again, my name is Jamie Wilson, Commissioner of Traffic for the Traffic Division, which is located within the Street Department. We have two asks of the committee for consideration. The first being a signal timing and detection package. This is something you see from similar to what our local neighboring agencies do, such as the county, St. Louis County and MoDOT, where they farm out their traffic signal timing. Typically on 5 to 7 years, you revisit your signal timing. So similar to that, this would be something where a consultant comes in, develops new signal timing, optimizes it for the current traffic flow, as sometimes patterns change, volumes change, to make sure you're meeting that demand of traffic. In addition, we would couple that with some additional vehicle detection installation. That helps us combat when there is no activity on a side street, for example. You're not sitting there to signal where you're waiting for nobody. Okay, so this allows us to put that equipment in the street to allow the traffic signal controller to tell if someone's there or not. If there's someone there, then they allocate the appropriate amount of signal time. If not, then it can return back to those coordinate phases on the main line. A goal, some pretty simple goals of this that we, as well as the county, MoDOT, and a lot of folks do in national best practice, is to try to reduce your unnecessary stops through a corridor. And that's the unnecessary idling due to a side street being up with no activity on it. A number of stops where your timing has perhaps been outgrown by the traffic that's driving it. So when they optimize that, in my 25 years of doing these type of projects, you can expect anywhere from 10 to 20% reduction in travel delays through a corridor during your peak periods of commuter traffic. And that's pretty substantial. That leads to, I've shown a couple estimates for lowering your fuel costs, less vehicle idling time, translates to less fuel consumption and less times you're filling up the car. It also results in a lower vehicle emission from those cars not starting and stopping as often or sitting there idling at a signal unnecessarily. And another benefit of such a thing as retiming your signals is that our signal timing cycles can be lowered. I think you would see this probably more typical on the far north and far south of all of our corridors, north-south corridors, where the traffic patterns or levels of volume actually have dropped as you get further away from those feeders, those interstates that are bisecting those corridors. So that allows us to lower those cycle lengths. So when you're a pedestrian, it translates to a less amount of time you're waiting there to cross the street. We've estimated this signal timing by consultants and vehicle detection installation by contractors to be approximately 2 million for our ask.
Jamie, I don't have my inventory in front of me. Was this a matched, or was this strictly 2 million local?
This was straight up just 2 million local.
Okay.
And I don't know if you want to take questions on this or
Yeah.
proceed to the next one.
Well, I tell you what. Let's do your next one, and then we'll go to questions.
Sure. So the next project is actually a phase 2 of a previous project that we were given funds through the capital committee. We call this our phase 2 improvements. Downtown, we have nearly a dozen underground lighting vaults, and that's where our substations are housed, and that's where we receive our power from Ameren. It's a step down to distribute to our local streetlights. Those dozen underground vaults were tight for right-of-way downtown. You don't have these sitting above ground, so they're underground. These are well past their age and could be considered antiquated. I've included a few pictures there of when they flood, or not flood, when it rains, it floods into them, and the drainage structures within them over time have just become beyond repair, beyond reasonable repair. As well as that equipment needs to be redesigned to current standards. The goal for doing such a project, having an engineer design these lighting vaults, as well as a contractor install them, would be to provide, like I said, more up to current standards for our technology. And by doing so, not having those vaults flood and being up to snuff with national best practice, the end result would be a much more stable downtown in terms of our lighting that we're able to provide. Typically, every time it rains, our guys spend a considerable amount of time down there pumping that water out there so we can get the streetlights back on by the next night. So that's obviously not a sustainable model and something we want to move to eliminate. So this phase 2 was estimated at 1.5 million. This is not, again, this is not a local match. This is just a straight up request. And that's in addition to the phase 1 that we were approved for previously at 500,000 that's currently underway in design. So this would help us round out that project downtown.
Okay. All right, let's go to some questions. Let's see. Okay. Is going to the traffic timing one, is there any study about the potential to reduce drivers running red lights?
With traditional signal timing, all that we can do to stop the bad drivers is to make sure that we've at least provided the correct calculations for those vehicle clearance intervals, which being your yellow and reds. I really can't stop that. That's why you do see speed camera lights or red light running lights to augment the system that you already have there. But alone, just at the signal timing level, there's nothing that I would consider best practice for reducing those times. I know there's been some approaches to thinking if you have more stops, it encourages people not flooring it through all greens. I've seen more than enough people that do some horrible things, whether there's a stop or whether there's a red or a green. So from my own experience in all these years, I've never seen something that works. And on that level, if there was, I would be more than willing to try it.
Yeah, I think there is a discussion to be had on the traffic cameras, but that's a separate conversation, I believe.
Mhm.
Will these timing improvements include signal pauses between red lights at busy intersections?
Just gonna pause this. Maybe a word. Happy to explain.
I'm guessing that is related to ensuring safety at the intersections when you do timing. I guess there's some built-in delay or something. Is that?
There, I mean,
Yeah,
the red. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I'll come
No, go
off
ahead.
mic just to explain that further. So yes, there are some intersections that I've noticed, maybe the math and the timing might be off to make this more possible, but there are some busy intersections that I notice when there is a red light, like say I'm going north to south, I'm stopped at a red light. There is a pause between east and west getting their green light. Like everybody is red for a period in time. And so I'm wondering if these timing improvements will include more of that throughout the city, because for me personally, and I'm a transplant, so I've had to learn the wild, wild west traffic rules of St. Louis and trusting cars and not traffic signals. But that seems to be like a really safe way for people who maybe are not as familiar with our wild, wild west traffic rules to take a pause before getting through to the intersection, even though they may have a green light. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And I think maybe I know what you're describing. Hopefully we don't have math errors out there, but what we do time is the appropriate. There's, established guidelines of how you calculate and program your yellow and red clearances. Sometimes it may seem like there's more of a pause between, but I think maybe you might be seeing that more in the city here. We do utilize almost nearly everywhere a leading pedestrian interval where the side street has just terminated at red, main line comes on, the walks actually come on with mainline traffic north south, for example, like your example. The walks will come on first by themselves, and then about 3 or 5 seconds later the green for mainline comes on. Traditional timing, those were linked together. The vehicle would come up while the ped also came up. With that leading pedestrian interval, it lets us stagger that start. So the peds get to go, and the cars who are itching to go, perhaps even to turn right or left, now the peds get that head start, and it raises awareness of the peds in the crosswalk and also gives them a physical staggered start in terms of time to get across there before the cars are off the starting line.
Do these new signals allow for prioritization for transit and emergency vehicles?
The signal equipment has always had that ability. If you have there are some old, the city did utilize some emergency preemption in the past. It's the same technology that's used for the lower prioritization for preemption associated with transit. So that's emergency and transit, utilize basically the same technology to interface a controller to preempt normal flow for that prioritized flow for those two types of modes. You would need additional exterior equipment to interface the controller and enable to do that. The main equipment is present in the signals. You would just need less equipment. Most of the work is done. The brunt of it's done. You just need some ancillary equipment to be able to utilize preemption for both transit and emergency.
That's in the vehicles themselves and not in the infrastructure. Is that what you're saying? Or
Traditionally, like the old style optical preemption, you would install a transmitter on a fire truck, and you would install an optical receiver at a traffic signal located on the mast arm. The fire truck going through with the blinking lights, not the red blues. It would be a white flashing light transmitting from the fire truck. There'd be an associated receiver on the other end receiving that, and that would translate into the traffic signal controller to say, hey, it's time. There's a fire truck coming. Let's push green to main line the way they're coming. The newer technology has more GPS based, where the fire truck has a device installed on the fire truck, and it communicates through the cloud, which has some associated equipment hooked into our traffic operations center, which hooks to our traffic signal server, which also hits that signal. So it's all done with the existing infrastructure, through the cloud with just a device installed at the fire truck versus a transmitter on top of the fire truck and additional equipment inside the cabinet. So a lot of different ways to do it. The newer technology is less demanding on additional equipment.
Hey, Paul, if I might add, the city has been having conversations with bi-state to pilot a transit priority corridor and possibly pursue smart city grants for that type of new technology. So it's an ongoing, active conversation.
Okay, thanks. Next. What was included in phase one of the lighting vault project?
That's more, we're still developing our specifications and design needs and parameters for our consultants. I wish we'd be further along, but with ARPA and a lot of things going on right now, there's a lot of issues we're addressing now, but this will be in concert with phase two, with phase one setting the way for it.
How many vaults are there, by the way?
10 or 12.
Okay.
I have to look up the number. I can send that to you later. If you
Okay, great.
It's actually 11. It's on capital inventory. And what I would just say about it is it's the start of it, and it was just funded partially because of the amount of funds that were available. So it gets the project going. So imagine if there's 11 vaults that it knocks out 2 or 3 of them, right? And then as we add funds to it, we'll just continue to go on down the line, taking from worst to best, replacing those vaults.
Okay, and so this is a follow-up. So the phase one was a concept and design, and a phase two is actually going to be the construction. Is that a way of looking at it?
I think phase one will probably have, and Jamie, you can add on to this, probably have a little more than just concept. It was 500,000, so I would think we'll get possibly a couple of 3 vaults done with the design work as well, and then have the design in place moving forward for the rest of them.
That's correct, Rich.
Okay, great, thanks. I thought I saw a message with a hand raised, and I didn't. Since I'm sharing screen, it's hard for me to. Was there a hand raised earlier? Someone? Okay. All right. Okay. So going back to, okay, that's traffic division. What is the next? I believe ADA, right?
Yes, if you would pull up that slide, I'll go over it briefly.
Let's see. There we go, and I'll share again.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So this is the American Disabilities Act Transition Plan. It's something that, again, I mentioned this in committee hearing yesterday. We have been working with Commissioner Newberg on since back in the Slay administration. This is a required plan by federal law to have in place. And basically, the Board of Public Service adopted the plan on February 6, 24. So it is very new, and we have just gotten it more or less in place. And so the plan identifies the removal of barriers to access that prevent access to city programs and facilities from being fully usable and accessible to people with disabilities. So, this is way beyond just sidewalks or handrails, and it's accessibility to every program that the city offers on that level for everyone. So, as we go through this, we currently had a $2 million allocation under ordinance 71504. But what is really key here is that we continue to fund this plan every year. And so somebody is going to ask, well, how much ultimately could this plan cost? David might say it could be 20, 30, $40 million. And we've just got into it with $2 million. We need to continue to fund it, because what happens is if we're not actively funding this program, even though we have the transition plan, the United States Department of Justice could come in and they could tell us what we need to fund and what we need to do. And so in my mind, this is a minimum that we need to fund on an annual basis. we could certainly fund more, and we certainly should fund more if the funds are available, but this is an absolute minimum consideration. And so some of the things, you'll see some of these lists going down that we have used, some of the original $2 million for, some restroom renovations, sidewalk improvements, ADA accessibility at our fire department headquarters, miscellaneous park sidewalk improvements, handrails, some doors at Soulard Market, and some wayfinding signage, as well as comfort station upgrades in parks. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to ask David, would you mind making a couple comments about this, please?
No, I would be happy to. But I think that you've described the issue very well. When the ADA was first enacted, all of the state and local governments, which include St. Louis, were required to develop a transition plan for eliminating barriers to access, and then that plan could be staged, and that meant that you didn't have to do it all at once. And so that's the reason why it's possible, if you do a reasonable amount every year, you're not challenged for things being inaccessible. Whereas when you don't have a plan, then if the Justice Department comes in, which they do in various places around the country, they make you fix everything all at once, which is it could easily be a massive amount of money money that the city doesn't have, and could be a major problem. The work that you're fixing is work where something is inaccessible, and it doesn't work, for example, when we build a new building and we have new sidewalks around that building. The money that's spent on those sidewalks is part of that development, and that money is not part of the transition plan. And for many years, the Board of Public Service and I have looked at many engineering plans, for private developers and whoever else. And we have expected those people who want to do that construction to take that cost into their own project. If you're putting in a new sidewalk, then the sidewalk has to be according to ADA standards, but that's over and above what the transition plan looks at. What the transition plan money should be spent for is where you're eliminating an access problem that otherwise wouldn't typically be touched. One of the things just recently that we've been trying to work on is that at the Gamble Recreation Center, there's a door that is locked. That's the only entrance to the building. And it used to be that it had an intercom system that somebody could ring and the door would be opened. And that intercom system failed long ago. Well, there's no big project fixing Gamble right now. It's not, unless the ADA transition plan money contributes to that. So the transition planning money that we're doing right now is to fix that intercom system so that people in wheelchairs can actually get into the Gamble Center. There's a lot more that needs to be done in the Gamble Center and many other places in the city. And so what we need is this allocation of transition plan money to fix things that otherwise would not be touched by development in the city. And so one great example of that is that when we repave these long arterial streets, the city is obligated under the ADA to make the intersections pedestrian accessible as you go along. That's not transition plan money. That's simply, if you're going to repave, you incur the expenses, you internalize the expenses of allowing people to get across the street. So it is important for us to understand this distinction, so that just because we do something that's nice and fully accessible, we can't just hang "this was transition plan money" on it. what we have to say is that's part of the project that we're doing. And then we need to go in the city and set priorities. The transition plan gives us guidance on how to set priorities, but a lot of the priorities, when you have any given money available, it should be responsive to citizen needs and circumstances that disabled people are having problems that they ought to be dealing with. I'm hoping the next money will be putting in some accessible traffic signals down in a south part of the city, because there's a series of people who are blind down there and who need to cross some streets to get to Metrolink, which is one of their major ways of transportation. Well, nobody would have that in mind to do that except for the complaints of those citizens, and makes sense then for us to give some significant priority to that problem.
Thanks, David. And I'll just add on again, just to make sure, you heard when John was presenting the street projects, the signal interconnect projects, the street type projects, we do the ADA accessible ramps as part of those projects. That is not transition funding. That is all part of the project. When we work with developers, we require them to build to ADA. So every project that we're doing, we are instilling that requirement above and beyond this. So this is for existing conditions for programs around the city. The idea with the ADA transition plan was we hired a consultant to work with my gentleman, ADA coordinator, and David, and go through and do inventories and come up with a plan of how to rectify some of the worst situations that are there. So I think that's a good introduction of it. Paul, it looks like we have a number of questions. We want to go to those.
Yeah, thank you, Rich, and thank you, David. One thing I did want to point out too is that this often throws me when you see something called a plan, because it sounds like it's more administrative rather than physical. But when we talk about this, we're actually talking about, sure, there is coordination and identification of the need, but these are actual physical projects that we are doing with these funds to make things more accessible. As well. So I just want to point that out, because that always jumps out at me, and I'm thinking, well, we ought to say transition plan and projects or something like that, just to give it that sort of concrete notion that there are projects being funded. Yeah, let's go to the chats. Let me go back to the beginning here. Okay. Most of our parks are nowhere near ADA compliance. How are park sidewalk improvement projects prioritized?
So if I start these off, David, will you supplement me, please?
Do you want to say something first?
Yeah, let me just make a couple of comments. So all these parks are part of, this inventory that is completed. And so, I think, again, whether it's a park, how it's utilized, what the facility is all part of this assessment that was made. And so they would be on the list for, repair of the sidewalk, if that's the case. If it's the playground itself, I know that when the Parks Department actually replaces playgrounds, they are ADA compliant, I believe. And I know when we do them through BPS, and we haven't done any for a while here, they are also ADA compliant. But keep in mind that I also mentioned to Mr. Ironsell earlier that we're going to work on this pilot program of this precision cutting of sidewalks and things of that nature to hopefully be able to quickly address some of the big sidewalk issues in the streets and parks. So David, you want to tail on behind that?
Sure. First of all, what I'd like to say is that there is a lot of constructions that the Parks Department has done in the last few years, or maybe many years, but there are a lot of, for example, restrooms that have been rebuilt to provide accessibility. That's been going on well before all of this discussion got started in the city. And anytime anytime the Parks Department does some kind of repair work, it always takes into account the accessible standards. Then in other circumstances, it is true that there are a lot of features of parks that are not accessible. And so that it becomes a question of, I mean, the number of barriers to access in the city is enormous. And so it becomes a question of which one do you do first? How do you do those priorities? And the transition plan tells us how to begin to figure out the priority, to figure out what we're going to do on a project. And, you know, this is, Rome was not corrected in a day kind of situation. So, I mean, if we had $15 million a year, then we could move a lot quicker than $2 million a year. But if what we have is a steady flow of that 2 million, we can reduce a lot of the problems that are involved, but it's going to be a while, maybe never in our lifetimes, that everything will be fixed. When I'm giving speeches, sometimes I like to point out that we have 2,000 miles of sidewalks in the city, and that's only a part of the problem with the transition plan. And fixing 2,000 miles of sidewalks, which I would best at least 3/4 of them need work, is just an enormous task. So what we have to do is to try to figure out what's most important for the disabled community, for us to address that, and then year by year do our best opportunity to make that serious conclusion. And what I worry about is to make sure that we aren't sort of doing a project and saying that was transition plan work when, you know, that's not really directly dealing with the accessibility issue that's there and otherwise wouldn't have been fixed.
Okay. This question from Ivy is sort of addressing what you just said, David, in terms of the time it takes. With this current schedule, 2 million per year, how long would it take for the city to become ADA compliant?
Well, my answer is that no old city is going to, perhaps in anybody's lifetime, become fully compliant. It's a process of moving closer and closer to it. And I think that's the defense under the ADA, which it's a defense that is good for the disability community. If you're trying, then, you know, you're doing what best you can do, and you're being proactive. So I think that's what puts us in, I think that is in compliance with the ADA.
How much of the city is ADA compliant already from downtown out to the city limits? I don't know if there's how do you gauge that, or is there an assessment of that?
No, how many buildings does the city have? 170 some, I think.
Yeah, it's 150 basically.
Yeah, I mean, they aren't all compliant, and it's important. While we are always talking about sidewalks, it's important to remember that it's all of our facilities, not just our sidewalks, that we're talking about.
Does the ADA plan have a full inventory of ADA sidewalk deficiencies? Also,
No,
how is the inventory list prioritized? As some of these things you've already hit on, but in case you want to add on it.
well, in terms of the inventory of all deficiencies, sidewalk deficiencies, we're not going to get to all of the sidewalk deficiencies. So that what we need to do is to identify some at some level of importance, or at least spread them around the city, and work on those and do an assessment of chunks of parts that we reasonably can work on in the not distant future. Because if you tried to do the whole city and spend the money on doing that, some of it you wouldn't get to 20 years down the road, and by then it would be changed or deteriorated more, or whatever the population could have moved. So that it is important that assessments, the transition plan be a cyclical kind of thing. It does some assessments, and then it makes some corrections, and then it does some assessments, and those things are going on simultaneously all the way through the process.
And then the second part of that question is how is it prioritized? I think you touched a little bit on that in terms of the individual needs of the community in a particular situation, whatever it is on a particular intersection or something that's been identified or.
Yeah, I remember an ADA coordinator from Kansas City. One time I asked her, how do they prioritize? And she said, well, I drive around the streets, and if I see an intersection with curbs, I know that's a priority. And if I see some curb ramps, even if they aren't perfect, that, you know, we move on to the intersection that has the curb. And in a way, prioritization in my mind is both citizen improvement, but it is also the city recognizing that it has an asset that really is important. Right now, I've always worried about how much money would be spent on City Hall, but right now, there are no accessible men's room on the public floors of City Hall. And so some of the money that we have put into that, out of, I believe there are two men's rooms on each four-story building. And now we're putting, we've only been able to do 2 restaurants, but we're rebuilding them right now on the 1st and 3rd floor. And at some point we need to go forward and correct the City Hall situation.
Do we have a list for each city park that is still needed?
Each city, I'm sorry?
Do we have a list for each city park that is still needed? I guess.
I mean, it's that same thing. In some ways, in some ways we need to hear from the Parks Department. We need to know about utilization of parks. And to me, as a matter of fairness, we need to spread things around the city, not necessarily, obviously not concentrating on the central corridor, but, you know, trying to make sure that we're working on upgrading the parts of the city that many people live in, and the areas that have had the problems, the equitable, unfair kind of neglect, that we focus on cleaning those up. And that illustrates there are certain government policies. We believe in trying to have an equitable community. Well, we should take that into account as we're making our prioritizations.
Okay. I believe that's the final presentation. Is that right, Rich? Or you have anything else on?
No, I believe that's it. And thanks to everybody that presented, and thanks, David, for jumping on and sharing your expertise.
Great. No, yeah, and thank you guys for both presenting. I do see, Ivy, you had your hand up. Is that from an old, or is that, do you still need it? Still have a question?
I do have some clarifying questions. Yeah,
Okay.
if I may. Where does this, I understand that, we've got the ADA plan, we're moving forward with it, and that keeps us compliant. But also, if I'm not mistaken, that the Adults with Disability Act was passed in the early 90s. So we're talking about, 30 years now that this has been in effect. So I'm curious as to where this number comes from. Where did that 2 million number comes from? And if it is the bare minimum, why is that? Why is not more? Obviously, the city budget is always going to be limited, but where does that number come from?
Others can answer that, but let me just begin the answer by saying that actually, when the ADA was passed, all state and local governments were supposed to have transition plans done by 1992, and the work was supposed to be done 2 or 3 years later. No city in the country was able to do that, or even took it seriously. And so in some senses, we are late, but I will tell you, compared to other cities around the country, we have moved up on the scale of people who are being responsible. And indeed, that's the reason that we have the plan and we're trying to eliminate barriers every year is very important, because the Justice Department goes around and looks for people who are just blowing the issue off. And you know, that then you start getting into litigations and all kinds of expensive collateral kinds of things. So then the question is, well, is $2 million a year enough? You know, I have no idea, but you got to do something, and there's no benchmark that answers that question.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Depending on what your particular topic of conversation would be, I know Rich could opine and talk to you about streets and bridges deficiencies and how much we need to be putting in that each year. And as you heard last week from Parks talking about their buildings, say, oh, how much we need to put in there each year. Next week, by the way, we're going to be hearing about vehicles citywide. And I know Chris Amos is big and saying, hey, we need to really be putting this much each year and that. And so, yeah, it's a perennial question. It's a great question, but it's also a perennial question. Unfortunately, every category we talk about, if we were looking at it, we'd say we're not putting enough each year into this particular capital need. So, yeah, that's why we have these discussions and these meetings, because we know that the needs out there are far greater than the funds that we have available. So we have to somehow identify with these limitations what we would want to recommend to fund.
So I would just add on to that and say, I think you guys explained it very well. And, you know, when we have a capital needs list that's in excess of $500 million, and you start looking at critical needs that are $168 million, and the pot to go around is about $36 million, it becomes really difficult to try to determine which ones are more important than the other ones, because let's be honest with you, they're all important for one reason or another. And so, I mean, it would be easy for all of us if we had $200 million and we could do some of the yellow and all the red and get through all this. But, you know, what we try to do is through conversations with folks like David and the street director and parks director and so forth, is we say to them, you know, something is better than nothing. And we want to make an effort. And in this case here, something has to be better than nothing, because we don't ever want to get into that situation where the United States Justice Department comes in and says, oh, well, you have a plan and you spent $2 million and now you stopped. And so they don't worry about the big list. So we're trying to be responsible stewards and say, we got to keep doing something. And we just felt like $2 million would get us something equitable where you could do something, you know, in different areas of the city. You start getting much below that, and all of a sudden it looks like you're minimum funding something just to get by. And that is truly not the case. It's, we want to do it. We just don't have the money to do what we want to do. Does that make sense? Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. I think we're coming up on the hour. Was there any? I thought I may have seen another hand raised, but
Yeah, this mine's Paul.
oh yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Encourage. I'm hoping that in the planning process, taking a good look in North St. Louis, because there's a lot of people over there that has suffered strokes. You know, and I don't know whether or not, you know, you have any data to determine, you know, where the majority of our disability citizens are living in, but there's a lot of people in North St. Louis who have suffered strokes and really needed accessibility. Secondly, but last, I just want to ask Rich. He gave us this information on the minority participation with the contract value. Is this the dollar amount that was allocated, or this is the overall dollar amount? Because I was asking about the dollar amount that was allocated to minority and women-owned businesses.
Yep. So what I tried to do is to give you some samples of, because remember I said like certain things, like purchasing of vehicles, there's no requirement to do particular things. So other contracts are underway. Other contracts are done through different vehicles because of the need. So what I tried to give you was a sample of some contracts that we have underway. These are the construction contracts portion of it, which is where that particular goal comes in. The convention center project actually is a $270 million project right now. It's the largest project on the books we have. I wanted to show you a snapshot of where we are on enterprise and workforce. So, you know that it is something that we are doing daily on all of our projects. Without
Yeah, I
you
was
having
actually
to
looking
break
at,
it down.
you gave me the Forest Park Lake renovation and the Khalid pedestrian lighting renovation. And the Forest Park was around a million too, and the Laclede was around 800,000. And you're showing a 40% participation in minority. But what was the contract amount of that $830,000? What was the contract amount awarded to the minorities in that $1 million contract? Those the numbers that I was asking about.
Yeah, and they're just percentages of the overall contract because that's how we keep it. Because Todd, what you got to remember is we have a contract with the general. We don't have a contract with the subs. So we overall issue them the total contract amount, and then their participation is based on the contracts they award to the subs, and that's how they report to us in percentages. So like on those projects, if you were interested and you wanted to get with Stacy at SLDC, they may have copies of those contracts. We do not, because we don't hold a contract with them. We only hold it with the prime.
When I talked to Ms. Roach said that she don't have the information, that she forwarded the information to public service. And that's why I was asking public service about the information, which I understand that contractors do, if you're doing a track and you hire somebody, out of the community that might, you give them $200 to do some on the job, that they count that as a participation. But I'm concerned about what is the overall dollar value to minority and women contractors that can have an impact on their lives, what can be equitable to the community. Not just, contractors give a small 2,000 and 3,000. You got a contractor been awarded $1 million contract, and he just gave a minority contractor a $500 contract, and he count that as participation. I don't think that's equitable.
So I'll go back and tell you that the ordinance 70767 outlines what the participation on these projects are. These are all reviewed by St. Louis Development through the Business Compliance Office before we award any contracts. They hold these contracts and they tell us award them or do not. So then after we award the contracts, as we go through them, they turn in utilization reports on a monthly basis. It is not just hiring somebody willy-nilly. There are a whole lot of other requirements that go with this, such as bond, insurance, prevailing wage. I mean, it's very intensive as to what they do, but I think that the dollar amount you could get out of it is by looking at the contract that's there and multiply it by the percent that's there, and that would tell you how much M and W are on those projects. Now, like I said, under the convention center, I gave you a pretty detailed breakdown to try to show you what those amounts are. And it took a substantial amount of time to put some of that information together. And I really was trying to be diligent to show you that this is an important factor to us. And it's something that is required by ordinance. And on the federal projects, I even showed you one of those, that federal goal of DBE is set by the feds, and we, MoDOT, and we have to achieve that when we bid our contracts, or the compliance office again, and the MoDOT compliance office would reject the contract. So it is not a willy-nilly thing. There's a lot of mentality that goes through all that.
Okay, thank you, Rich.
Yes, sir.
All right, all. Yeah, we're running a little late. I do want to thank both our presenters as well as members of the committee for a very active discussion about streets and traffic and our capital needs. As I mentioned, every time we have another category to go through, we always want to the tendency, we want to put it all into that category because that we see all the need that's there. And of course, the big challenge is trying to allocate what little we have across all the need categories. So next week, we're going to be meeting at the same time on 29th, next Thursday, 5:30, and we're going to be going over all the fleet categories, citywide, fire and police, and we hope to see you then. But otherwise, thank you again and have a good evening.
Bye-bye.